About a week ago, I got a strange letter from my father. That's strange enough. My father was a good-for-nothing drunk who, if he tired of beating my mother, would then find relief in beating me. To make matters worse, he died a month ago. So, seeing that letter was from him, it was easy to ignore it. But I've always been too curious for my own good. The feeling, the want to know, it eats at me. And soon I found myself scouring through years' worth of discarded trash at the dump to find that letter again. I found it. But the news was not what I expected. It began in his elegant contract writing cursive, and only seen when he was making business deals in the few instances where my mother had finally forced him to take me along. Well, I suppose it was a bid to bring us closer together somehow. It didn't work. Those instances were some of the most boring and worst moments of my life. The letter began, "Let me start by telling you that I am sorry." It began, the letter began, "Let me start by telling you I am sorry." If you're even reading this, then that old sense of curiosity has finally gotten to you. But regardless, I'm sorry. For I know this will be your downfall, and yet I still seek to communicate to you that there's something you ought to know. Something you have every right to know. I never truly hated you, or your mother and sister. Though I know you all felt that way. I was trying to protect you. I thought I could save you from it as long as I kept it from feeding on you. As long as I kept it eating at me. But it has devoured me. And at 32, I am whittling away as my father did before me. This is not natural. I must tell you everything, so you are better equipped to deal with this horror. I love you, son. I always have, but I haven't been able to show it. It's not because I did not want to, and it's not because I was afraid to, but because I could not. I was unable to show my family the love that you so rightfully deserved. The day my life changed forever, I'd spent all day courting a lovely woman named Edna Friggum, who lived on the farm about 20 miles south of our little farm. My large wooden door crept open slowly at first, then moved out of the way of a tall man who stood, a pitch-black silhouette, like a tower eclipsing the sun. He stood in that threshold. It was Big Bo, Papa's best and strongest slave. As far as niggers went, he was the only one who Father trusted and often had to keep the others in line. We lived in the upper New York area, too close to the uncharted wilderness, and we'd had several slaves try to escape through them. Some of them even tried to revolt, but Papa put them in their place, and Big Bo was right there at his side. After the terrible war one Mama had effectively saved me from attending, Papa told us We just have to keep them a secret. But we'd never let them go. Slave labor's cheaper than paying workers after all. And for a struggling crop farm out in the upper New York area that just barely seemed to die a little slower every year, paying a labor force would have been a death sentence. Back then, I simply thought they liked working for Papa. They always seemed so happy and content, and they never complained. In fact, they outright bent over backward to impress Papa. If only I'd talked to him more, asked him to change. Nowadays, I'm astounded at my ignorance. I was 17 years old. I should have been able to understand fear and anxiety when I saw it. But Papa did his best to shelter us from the harsh reality of slave labor. That night, the night I was awoken by screams of terror, howling men, and the flickering blaze of flames reaching high into the air. I could see the light from my window right next to my bed that overlooked the barn and a small crop field. I was going to look outside, but that's when Big Bo stepped forward. He was covered in blood. It's the first thing I'd noticed on his shirt, which was originally a bit of a tan. His dark skin was black as night. It was hard to see him with the small candlelight behind him and the flickering from the window, but I could make out his unusually glistening red teeth. They seemed to glow with the whites of his eyes, most likely due to his darkened skin. I remember it being so charcoal black, the blackest void I'd ever seen. The dark still haunts me till this day because of that sight. Even now, as I write this, it shows me them, the ones it controls. They're coming to get me. No amount of maids and secure housing will stop them. He called my name in his booming, piercing voice. His eyes were wild and open. "Bo," I said, sounding like a lamb in the lion's den. "Bo, what's going on outside? Is there a fire?" "There is," he said, seemingly choking a bit, and his neck twitched just a tinge to the right. "There is a fire in me, James." He walked forward. I could see that the blood was worse than it first seemed. He was drenched in it. It covered the top of his head and streamed down his face in rivulets around and over his eyes. It was dripping from his chin and staining his hands. His hands. He was carrying something in his right hand, something wrapped in dark green cotton. It was sopping wet, with too much blood pooling at the bottom. I looked him up and down, and he must have seen the look of sheer terror on my face. He simply laid it at the foot of my bed. That bloody jacket. He took hold of a metal object sticking out of the back of the jacket and wrenched it. There was a squelching and squishing. It was so small a sound, but somehow I heard it. even over the horrified screams and yelling outside. It finally came loose with one loud shunk of a sound, and I heard the pitter-patter of blood hitting the ground. He left the bloody package there and held the hook in his hand. It was a hook for bleeding and holding pigs upside down. But we were a crop farm. We tried so many different types of crops, I can't even remember what we focused on after all these years, but one thing I know for sure. We were not a cattle farm. There was no need for instruments to bleed animals around here. He never took those piercing eyes off me. The black of his pupils fixated me. I couldn't look away. Even though I heard my name being called outside. No, screamed outside. They were enormous in his eyes. Too big. He slowly dipped his hand into the jacket. There was squishing. Then he pulled a piece of red flesh, so fresh it was steaming slightly in the night air. I always wanted to taste some fresh meat, but your papa never let us have it, said Big Bo. He was a very dedicated man, your father. He chewed and spoke with his mouth filling with more of that red meat, always focused on the farm, or what fucking little there was. He spoke in past tense. I remember missing some of the things he said because I was fixated on the fact that he was using past tense. Between the squishes and slurps as he devoured the bleeding meat in the coat, he continued. It's time. Sudwapanuk calls us. Come follow young James. There are so many who want to taste your flesh too. With that, he left, and I sat there, listening to the screaming, and stuck to my bed for far longer than I cared to admit. Thoughts of my family in pain and crying out for me ran through my mind, and every time Big Bo's eyes, his teeth, his warning rang through me. And if I was finding the strength to stand, that memory would make my muscles constrict on reflex alone and plant me firmly back in the reality that I was not going to move a muscle, probably for that entire night. Thoughts of my cowardice pricked and shamed me. Thoughts of my mother and my sister Alicia. My thoughts of Papa always led me to think that he was inside that jacket, and that made me shudder with fear. I finally mustered the small bit of courage it took to turn and look through the window at my bedside. I saw my mother, screaming and writhing on the ground, one of the slaves on top of her. I covered my mouth in disgust and rage, and tears swelled in my eyes. She struggled and fought and screamed, but he was bigger and stronger She scratched and kicked and bit and even drew blood and tore flesh, but he seemed unfazed by what must have been intense pain. The others stood around this grisly scene, but they were not participating. Some of them were carving strange symbols into the skin, triangles with circles at each point, all over their bodies. Some on the forehead, others on the cheek or chest. Then others were driving metal shards and farm tools through parts of their bodies, and engaging in something I'd later come to realize resembled ritual scarification. They would drive wood into their noses and rip their ears and break their teeth out. Blood was streaming from each of them. There was not a clean body in that field. Others still were heating the farm tools they had in the raging fires that dotted the field. Some of them even set fire to the wood around the metal, and it caught to their hands, yet they hardly noticed. As I watched the horrifying spectacle, a scene straight from hell itself, I struggled to keep my flipping stomach from giving up the stew I'd had earlier that night. But then, one of them looked up into my window. He looked directly at me, and his face immediately twisted into an enraged grimace. He screamed at me in some foreign language. It was a language that sounded familiar, but yet so alien. It was certainly not African in origin. One of the slaves next to the one that spotted me slammed the ground with the reaping tools he carried, and he darted forward toward the house. The others simply began walking to the house, looking directly at me the entire time, that enraged stare on his face. I knew they were coming for me. And finally, I was able to move. I leapt from my bed and slipped my pants on, stomping and tripping until I finally got them on. I didn't bother tucking my shirt, and I never managed to get my shoes on. I reached into my dresser drawer, looking for the knife, the hunting knife. Father had given me a hunting knife, but it was gone. I ran to the doorway and heard the downstairs door slam open and the howling begin. The hooting and howling made it easy to know where he was as he came stomping and rampaging up the stairway, slashing and slamming into the walls. He decimated the pictures that hung on the way up and splashed blood all over the place. He broke through my doorway and leapt onto my bed, slashing, kicking, and stabbing and tearing, and he never noticed, or he never cared that I wasn't there.